People are still entering the call, but I think we should make a start. Can I start by just welcoming everyone, and welcome to, this is the 13th webinar in the Human Behaviour Change Project webinar series. You may have been expecting to see, sorry, can we go back to the slide that gives the title? So we're introducing the theory and techniques tool. And you may have been expecting to see Susan Mickey introducing this today, but Susan can't be with us. So instead, I'm Mary Johnston from the University of Aberdeen, and I'm accompanied by Marta Marquez.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Marta Marques from the University of Lisbon, and I'm an associate with the Center for Behavior Change. And I've been working in the Human Behavior Change project since its beginning.
And so Susan can't be here, but some of you may recognize that I'm sitting in Susan's study and using Susan's computer. Okay, to get on to the webinar for today, the agenda for today is a 25-minute video presentation followed by 25 minutes of discussion. The discussion format is just various ways you can get involved in the discussion. If you have any questions, post them on the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. Upvote any of the questions you want answered, and we'll try to answer those questions first. And use the chat box to share any thoughts or reflections or things that you might want to be saying. We'll answer as many of the questions, of your questions as we can during the discussion, but we keep a record of all the questions and try to deal with them on Open Science Framework, and certainly share the questions because the questions are informative as well as being of interest during the webinar. The webinar will be recorded, as are all of the webinars in the series, and the webinar recording will be uploaded onto YouTube. The slides will also be available on the Open Science Framework, so that anything that you're wanting to see in more detail, you can look at in that format. And we'll email you the links to the recording and webinar slides after this presentation. Okay, so we're now going to start the presentation, which will take about 25 minutes. Thank you.
Welcome to this webinar that is part of the webinar series of the Human Behaviour Change Project. This webinar will be on linking behaviour change techniques to their mechanisms of action and introducing the theory and techniques tool. It will be presented by myself, Susan Mickey, and my colleague, Mary Johnston. The aims of the webinar, firstly, to summarise the advantages of applying theory to developing and evaluating behaviour change interventions. Secondly, to present the theory and techniques tool and consider how it can be applied. And then to outline how behaviour change techniques and mechanisms of action feature within the behaviour change intervention ontology, which I'll introduce at the end. Is theory useful? Well, first of all, it helps to reduce waste in research by guiding the development of interventions, their evaluations, and also synthesizing evidence of effectiveness. However, this requires using good theory, and it also requires being able to link theoretical constructs and processes to behaviour change techniques. Therefore, we need to make theory more useful and usable to researchers, intervention designers, trial methodologists, and evidence reviewers. So what is the Theory and Techniques tool? It's a free online platform that links behaviour change techniques, often called BCTs, with their mechanisms of action. We're shortening it here to MOAs. And MOAs are the processes by which BCTs bring about change. We've developed it by analysing, first of all, published literature to find out how authors think about the links between BCTs and mechanisms of action, and also expert consensus, i.e. looking at the agreement between experts, both about what is linked together, but also what is definitely not linked together. This tool can be found at this website, the Human Behaviour Change Project, and here is the URL to find it. Why have we developed the Theory and Techniques tool? Well, primarily to help people apply theory to intervention, development and evaluation, but also to help people to understand the theoretical basis of interventions that haven't explicitly been developed on the basis of theory. And to maximise the rate of scientific advance, we need to share data and knowledge as easily and efficiently as possible, work in coordinated consortia as much as possible rather than as isolated teams, and interact with colleagues globally, asking questions and providing answers. So this is also another motive for us to develop this tool. So this is what I mean by the links. Here we have on the left the behaviour change techniques, which we define as potentially active ingredients within an intervention designed to change behaviour. On the right is the behaviour we're trying to change, anything a person does in response to internal or external events, and then linking these to our mechanisms of action, i.e. the processes through which a BCT affects behaviour. And here's an example of it. On the left, we've got prompts and cues as a behaviour change technique. On the right, medication adherence as a behaviour. And the mechanism of action linking these two are memory, attention and decision processes. So for this tool, we selected 74 behaviour change techniques from the behaviour change technique taxonomy. There's an app for anybody, a smartphone app for anybody who'd like to see more about it, and we also have free online training here. So the structure, we have 93 techniques and 16 groupings, and just using some screenshots from the app here to demonstrate it. We have categories, so on the left here you have the first 8 of the groupings of the 16. And then if you look at number 1 there, goals and planning, move over to the right, you'll see a screenshot on goals and planning and the specific techniques within goals and planning, and the first 8 out of 9 are demonstrated here. And then if you look at 1.1 there, the goal setting of behaviour, then on the right you'll see the definition of that technique and examples of it, and also notes about how it differs than other techniques that one might get confused with. So when it came to the mechanisms of action, we identified 26. We did this by taking the 14 mechanisms of action from a framework that myself, Mary and other colleagues developed many years ago called the Theoretical Domains Framework. This was another expert consensus exercise that looked at constructs and processes from theories of behaviour change and identified these 14 broad domains. However, subsequently, myself and another group of colleagues did a systematic review of theories of behaviour change. We identified 83. So what we looked at were what were the domains there in addition to the 14 that we'd already identified 10 years earlier. And here we see the next 12 that we added to make 26. So these were the most frequently cited domains in the 83 theories. Now I'll pass over to Mary Johnston, who will talk about how the tool was created.
Thanks, Susan. Susan has told you why we want to create the TAT tool. I'm now going to tell you a little bit about how it was created. First of all, she brought together a team of people. Susan brought together a team of people, including Miranda Bruin, Alex Rossman, Mike Kelly, Rachel Carey, Lauren Connell, Hilary Groark and Derek Johnston. And the project was funded by the MRC. TAT was developed in 4 studies. First of all, a literature synthesis. Secondly, an expert consensus. Thirdly, triangulation of those 2 studies. And an additional study about clustering of BCTs. And the publications for each of these studies is there. I'm going to describe the first 3 studies. First of all, the literature synthesis study was a systematic review of peer-reviewed behaviour change intervention reports. We looked for where authors made an explicit link between a BCT and a mechanism of action. And we identified a link where the link observed was observed more common than by chance. So there were 93 possible BCTs and a possible 26 mechanisms of action. That gave a possibility of 2,418 links. We found 70 BCTs and 25 mechanisms of action in the published reports. And when we looked at the number that were links beyond chance, we found 87 links involving 51 BCTs and 24 mechanisms of action. In the expert consensus study, we recruited 100 international behaviour change experts. There were 3 consensus stages. First of all, they rated the links, then they discussed them, then they re-rated them. They were rating whether there was a link or a non-link. Did they think this BCT and mechanism of action were linked or were not linked? And we looked for a criterion of 80% agreement. Here, there were only 61 BCTs investigated because of the practicalities of involving ratings of so many BCTs and 26 mechanisms of action. Of this possible 1,586 possible links, the experts rated agreement with criterion for a total of 90 links involving 51 BCTs and 20 mechanisms of action. So did the 2 methods have similar findings? We then conducted this triangulation study. The studies are different. In the literature synthesis study, we investigated every link that authors made, and it resulted in more BCTs than were practical to investigate in an expert consensus. We investigated links and the absence of a link. And this gave us evidence of past thinking at the time that people were developing practical interventions. In the expert consensus study, there were practical limits to the number of BCTs that could be investigated, and we limited it to 61. Here we were looking for explicit links, but we could also investigate, in addition to links, we could identify non-links. And here we were looking at evidence of current opinion and not restricted by what was practical to implement in an intervention. In the triangulation study, we did 2 things. First of all, we assessed concordance, and we used multi-level modelling to see to what extent the data from one study predicted the data from the other study. And then we compared the links. So we found evidence of concordance, and then we looked to see whether similar links were found by the 2 methods. Secondly, there were some discrepancies, links that were marginal or inconsistent between the 2. And so we conducted a reconciliation study in which we involved 16 new experts and looked for agreement between them as to whether or not there was a link. And here again, we looked for the 80% agreement level. So this is the summary of the whole thing. Overall, we found 92 possible links involving 51 BCTs with 22 mechanisms of action, and overall 465 non-links. So in the diagram on the left is the literature synthesis study, and on the right the expert consensus study, and you see how we move down to the point at which we have 87 links from the literature synthesis and 90 links from the expert consensus. In the triangulation study, excuse me, we found concordance and we found evidence for 37 shared links. In the reconciliation study, the new experts identified a further 55 links, making a total of 92 possible links, and they also identified 465 non-links. We used these links to construct the TAT tool, and here we're showing what the home screen looks like. On the left are the BCTs, and along the top are the mechanisms of action. Here is the code for what each cell represents. So the green cells represent links, the blue cells non-links, the yellow cells were inconclusive, and the white cells no evidence. I'm going to expand on that in the next slide. So a green link is a link that exceeded the criterion in both the literature and the consensus studies, or the exceeded criterion in the triangulation study. Inconclusive are inconclusive or marginal links. So they met the criterion for a link in either the literature or the expert consensus study, but not the other, or there was marginal evidence in either the literature and or consensus study, and it wasn't resolved in the triangulation study. The non-links did not meet criterion in the literature study and exceeded the criterion for a non-link in the consensus study, or they exceeded the criterion for a non-link in the triangulation study. Absence of evidence was where they didn't meet the criteria in the literature study, did not meet the criteria for a link or a non-link in the consensus study, and were not included in the expert consensus study. In this next slide, I'm going to illustrate how we've used TAT to design an intervention. There were three things that we needed to know. What's the behavior we wanted to change? What could be changed to change that behavior? What might be the mechanism of action? And thirdly, what are the BCTs that might change that behavior? And the example I've chosen is adherence to physical distancing during COVID-19 in a general public population, and where we're aiming for increased frequency. We'd already found that people with more self-efficacy, and more confidence that they can do it, were more likely to adhere to physical distancing. So we chose self-efficacy as the mechanism of action. When we look at the TAT tool, self-efficacy comes under the heading of belief and capabilities. Belief about one's ability to successfully carry out a behavior. And we've identified some links and some non-links. So the links for this mechanism of action included problem solving, demonstration of the behavior, verbal persuasion about capability, focus on past success. Non-links, things that would be unwise to use to change self-efficacy, were information about consequences, incentives, prompts and cues. So in the intervention we developed, we used verbal persuasion and focus on past success. In developing the intervention, we created a message which you see on the right. About 8 out of 10 people in Scotland who have taken part in the study before say they're managing to keep 2 meters distance from other people, most or all of the time, which shows that people like you can do this. So here we have a combination of past success and verbal persuasion, and it was delivered online. And we measured the effectiveness of the intervention on mechanism of action and on behavior, and saw some success of this intervention. But TAT can be used in other ways too, so I've illustrated how it can be used to design an intervention. But it can also be used to understand how an intervention changes behavior. Why was that intervention effective? Was it effective because it changed a particular mechanism of action? It can also be used to explain failure. Did the intervention not work because it failed to move or to make any alteration to the mechanism of action? A third possibility is to use it to link to theory. If you've identified the mechanisms of action in a particular intervention or in a particular behavior that you're observing, then it's possible to suggest what theory might be an overall explanation of what's happening. The fourth thing that you can do with TAT is to link the mechanism of action to measures of these mechanisms using evidence from SOBC. SOBC is the Science of Behavior Change, a project happening in the United States, which is looking to develop good measures of mechanisms of action. So this is a collaborative project where we link with the Science of Behavior Change measures. I'm going to illustrate how you might do that. So for example, if under the mechanism of action you've got a particular interest in goals, and the definition is given there, then underneath the definition of goals, you'll see this link, View SOBC Measures. And if you click on that link, it links you to the Science of Behavior Change measures. And here is what you would find if you clicked on the SOBC measures for goals. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 possible measures that you could use to measure goals. The TAT can be used to not only to look at evidence, but to generate evidence. So users can access data about the strength of links, and that's what I've already illustrated. But you can also, on TAT, share resources relating to the links. So resources that relate to articles about these links, data about these links, presentation about these links, or media about these links. It's also possible to engage with other people, to comment on, ask questions, and engage in discussions about the links, advancing our way of scientific thinking about the links. And it's also possible to seek collaborators, make suggestions for collaborations about research. So importantly, TET is not just a static tool that allows you to observe the link. It allows you to think about how you might work with others to advance the links. And TAT fits into an overall program, which we're describing as the Behaviour Change Intervention Ontology. And Susan is going to describe that for you now.
I mentioned the Behaviour Change Intervention Ontology earlier. I'll very quickly introduce it here. So, Theory and Techniques tool links two of many entities within the Behaviour Change Intervention Ontology. Here's the URL to more details about it. You can find it on Welcome Open Research, where we have a collection of papers. As we know, it's linking the behaviour change technique, i.e. the content of the intervention, with the mechanisms of action, the process. Now here's the top level of what the ontology looks like. So here's a green arrow, and if you just look at the two boxes within the green arrow, you'll see the intervention, the content, the behaviour change techniques, and the mechanisms of action. And on the right hand side, at the bottom there, you see the target behaviour. Now, what you'll also see is the relationship between intervention and mechanisms of action is moderated by the exposure, that is, the extent to which the intervention has reached and is engaged with. It is also moderated by the context, the type of population and the setting. And if you want to understand what's going on in terms of the effect of an intervention on an outcome behaviour, then you really need to think about all of the entities that are in the blue box working together, not separately. We have been very keen to make the evidence accessible, so you can find the tool very easily on the Human Behaviour Change website or on your mobile phone, as we mentioned earlier, and you can see how it forms part of the Human Behaviour Change project. So in summary, we've developed the Theory and Techniques tool to apply theory to intervention, development and evaluation, to understand the theoretical basis of interventions not explicitly developed on the basis of theory, and to maximise the rate of scientific advance by sharing data and knowledge as easily and efficiently as possible, working in coordinated consortia and interacting with colleagues globally. That's the idea. The extent to which it's been taken up in that way is another matter. So future development. The behaviour change technique taxonomy is actually being developed itself into an ontology. And this means that we'll be able to make a more extensive ontology, which is a more elaborate type of taxonomy. We're going to have better labels and definitions and be looking at the relationships between behaviour change techniques. And all of that will be being done on the basis of feedback that we've got from many different exercises over the years, and looking at literature and doing our own ontological consensus exercise. One thing that's very important to realise that ontologies are not static, but they're developed by the user community on the basis of feedback and advancing knowledge. We hope to publish the behaviour change technique ontology later on in the year, and indeed finish the whole behaviour change intervention ontology later on in the year. They'll all be open access, and we're going to be launching a new behavioural and social science ontology foundry, which will enable not only this ontology, but other ontologies in this domain, because presently the whole idea of ontologies is very biomedically focused, and we want to ensure that it's a really good place for what we hope will be a very expanding grouping of behavioural and social science ontologies. I hope you found this webinar helpful. Please do have a look at the details on the Human Behaviour Change website, and do join in. We send newsletters out regularly, and you can sign up there, and you'll keep abreast of the developments we've been talking about here and the many other developments of the project. Thank you.
Hi, sorry, I had a bit of a delay in getting my video to work. At the end of that presentation, Susan referred to things that we were publishing and the fact that these are living things that are developing all of the time. So that since we recorded this, we've made some progress on both the development of the behavior change techniques ontology and the mechanism of action ontology. The mechanism of action ontology is already published, and the behavior change techniques ontology will be published within, it's being processed now, it will be available within the next week. And I think that's going to be put up on the chat for you to see the references. We have quite a lot of questions, and the most uptick one is the one about from anonymous attender, but uptick by number of people. Which time horizon was chosen for stating a behavior changed? Is the tool valid for short and long-term behavior changes? I'll start off by answering that, and Martha may want to come in. So that we didn't choose a time horizon. So in the literature review, we took whatever the authors were using to make that statement. But in addition, when we're looking at the expert consensus studies, we're not doing studies that establish whether these techniques change behavior. We are only saying that BCTs have the potential to change behavior. And it's very easy to get drawn into believing that we've demonstrated that they're effective and they're affected by these processes. That's not what we mean at all. What we mean is that experts and people publishing in the field agree that these are likely ways of going about it. So that if you're starting to design a new intervention and you don't know where to start, this gives you an idea, a way to start in on developing the intervention. Anything you want to add, Martha?
No, not in relation to that question, just to reinforce that if you look at the literature review, and I think the links are on the slides on Open Science Framework, you will see that there was a good variety of health behaviors, so dietary behaviors, physical activity, alcohol, smoking cessation, lots of different things. But there's no information about the duration of the interventions or when was the behavior change assessed, because as Mary said, that was not the purpose of the study in itself. They were selected based on reporting or not the links between MOAs and BCTs, so that was the main purpose.
But it nicely highlights the fact that when we don't have, time is another dimension that we need to think about when we're looking at the whole ontology of behavior change in the Human Behavior Change Project. The next question is about the difference between inconclusive and absence of evidence. The difference between them is that with the ones that are rated inconclusive, we probably have a reasonable amount of evidence, but it doesn't seem to be conclusive. And if you think about it, there are bound to be links that are, there's no way of being sure that whether it's a good link or not. So they will probably remain inconclusive even if we've got more evidence. Whereas absence of evidence is where we don't have enough studies to really say that we've tested it. That's the difference between them.
Yeah, so if you go to the tool on the website, where you have the explanation on how to use the tool, you will see the criteria that was used for considering link or non-link or inconclusive. And as Mary was explaining, there was the percentage, and I think that was also in the recording. But if you want to have a look at it in more detail, you will see the criteria for the literature review, expert consensus, and triangulation study to make that decision. It's all there.
And if you click on a box, all the evidence from each of the studies will be provided for that box. So if you click on a green box, it'll tell you what the results were for the literature review. It'll tell you what the results were for the expert and for the triangulation, so you can see what the evidence is. The next question from Vicky Birch is about, can you confirm if the app or tool is a digital form of the behavior change wheelbook or builds on this with further BCT and linked MOAs? Martha, do you feel up to answering that one?
Sure. So this is a different tool. It's not intended to be BCW digital tool. So, you know, the book describes the full process of using the behavior change wheel, in which the identification and selection of behavior change techniques and mechanisms of action are just two of the steps that you can use when you're developing an intervention. The mechanisms of action that you will see in the tool are actually also described in the book, where you have the explanation of the constructs from the theoretical domains framework. So you will see that some of them actually link with that. And the BCTs, they are all part of the behavior change techniques taxonomy V1. So you will find that these are the same BCTs. But again, the purpose was very different. So when you look at the book and you have the links between BCTs and constructs from the theoretical domains framework and the combi model in the book, this was a matrix that was done at the time with a small group of researchers and experts to identify which ones were more frequently used, less frequently used. And here we're talking about a larger study, both from the literature and expert consensus, to identify links that are established between them. So not sure if I answer the question, but different tools where you'll find important information if you're looking at the selection of BCTs and MOAs.
One of the problems people have with the kind of work that we do is that we're forever updating and advancing. And so people who are familiar with the behavior change technique taxonomy are aware that we're now developing an ontology, and that's what we're publishing now. And so here's someone who's well aware of this, an anonymous attendee, saying, what plans are there to update this tool, given that there are now 200 BCTs identified via the BCTO and the Human Behavior Change Project? My answer to that is that's the kind of thing we aspire to do, but we don't currently have plans to do. So don't expect anything in the next month. But it is always a dilemma of what we do, that by the time we publish it, it's kind of out of date. But the one thing we have done is we've made a link from the behavior change techniques that are in the ontology. Do you want to talk about that, Martha?
Yeah, so yeah, I'll start with that and I'll make a point then about how this can help in terms of improving the tool, or, you know, next versions or whatever it's going to be in the future. But in relation to that, so if you look at the paper, and just a note on that, the preprint that was added to the chat doesn't have the mapping yet, because we added the mapping after the first feedback we received. So the next version, the version that was now submitted and will be available in the next couple of weeks, will have the mapping. But we did the mapping between the BCTT V1, so the taxonomy, and the ontology, so that people can see what corresponds to what, and then a clear explanation of the BCTs that were added, why they were added, how they are different in terms of the classification and the way that they are approached in terms of their groupings. So I think that will be quite useful, and that will make it really easy then to link with the tool and the MOAs there. Just another note in terms of updating this thing. So the Human Behavior Change Project, by developing the ontology of behavior change techniques and the ontology of also mechanisms of action, will allow in the future to have evidence from these links from the literature, right? So from the previous webinars, if you attended, or if you look at the recordings on YouTube, you will see that one of the aims is to have this knowledge system that can synthesize information. So in a, we hope, ideal research scenario in the future, if research reports have detailed information about BCTs and mechanisms of action, we will be able to get this information from when we are searching this knowledge system and other tools that will be available.
You may have noticed that the TAT tool does have the opportunity for posting resources and developing collaborations. And, you know, if you're working on a particular link, you can look for people who are working on that link. The other point that Martha's alluding to is that because we're developing all of these tools as ontologies, ontologies will give a unique identifier to each BCT and each mechanism of action. And if in the future they're updated, it will be possible to track it back through the ontology system so that it won't be required for us to be doing the links in a sort of retrospective way. That will be part of the process of developing the ontology. I love the idea that there's lots more work to be done, Martha. There's another question about how the book might refer to the website. I actually don't know the answer to that, because the book is a kind of closed, it's a finished system, isn't it? So the answer to that one is I don't know, but we'll get the team to answer that online. Okay, is there a risk that we can blindly design interventions using the TAT tool, taking it as gospel, and as a result neglect areas and absent of the links, but just absence of evidence? I think this is a really nice question, and I think it's really important that people don't overestimate what the TAT tool does. That's why we think it's quite important that you recognize the basis of what we've done. This is not based on the evidence of links. This is based on opinions about links. And it can help you to design an intervention, but we would certainly expect that as part of your evaluation of your intervention, you'd be establishing whether you had made a change on your mechanism of action as you predicted. And if you didn't, then you would not be expecting to have a change, but you can test it in your intervention. The more pressing issue is the idea that it might blind us to other things that we aren't aware of at the moment. And if there are new things get developed, do we end up ignoring them because we're happily padding on with the TAT tool, which was okay in its time, but needs to be updated? I think that's a real question for people designing interventions. The TAT tool is only meant to be something that helps you to make good guesses, and importantly, helps you to think about links that might not be useful. That doesn't stop you testing them, but it's just saying that the experts in the field don't think that's likely to be a winner. Anything to add, Martha?
Yeah, I think as I mentioned before, it is a starting point. It can help you with some initial decisions, but as you know, in any intervention, you need to do the field work and you need to do the first steps to identify exactly where you want to go. But I think in my view and from my experience, there are a lot of situations where you have people developing interventions outside the research area. So, you know, in practice, where it is really helpful to have a starting point. And I think, Mary, as you said, identifying where there are situations where it doesn't seem to be a link according to experts and according to the literature review can be quite helpful, because I think that sometimes we consider that certain BCTs are associated with mechanisms of action, and that may not be the case, and then can help in terms of, you know, reducing also waste of resources when you're selecting what you're going to do. But it is a starting point, and it is a complementary tool to also using the frameworks to develop interventions such as the behavior change wheel.
The next question is also about new developments. So similar to the TDF, can we associate the 12 new MOAs with the themes in COMBI? Right, the 12 MOAs that we used in developing the TAT tool came from the major review of series and the theoretical constructs that were being used. So it arose from, I think there were something like 1,700 constructs in the 83 theories, and those were grouped into domains. And what was done in developing the TAT tool was to say, are there domains that are not represented in the TDF? And so we added a further 12. but we didn't have the resources to do more than that, because you need so many experts, because otherwise you've overloaded experts and it's not possible to do it. Having said that, Martha will maybe tell you how many MOAs there are in the new MOA ontology. There are a lot more than 26.
Yeah, 282 entities
Yeah.
on 7 levels. Of course, it is a different way of organizing them, but you know, it's a different level of granularity. But it is expected that any of the MOAs can be matched into the COM-B categories, because the COM-B components, so capability, opportunity, and motivation, for those that are listening and don't know what the COM-B model is, these are 3 broad categories that in which any construct, any process, or any mechanism of action can be included depending on what they are aiming for. So you have different mechanisms of action for motivation, for capability, and for opportunity. So in case there is anything that doesn't match those categories, then it means that we need to have a look at that, but they should match. And I'm not entirely sure in terms of the new book. And again, this is something we can post later. So I'm not sure if the list of MOAs linked to the COM-B models is more extensive in the new book, but we can have a look at that and provide that information too.
Yeah. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Can this be used on any health areas? For example, nutrition, school feeding problems, food fortification. Really, what we apply it to is not the health area, but the behavior. And in any situation in which you're looking to apply a BCT, before you even think about what's the BCT, you've got to think what's the behavior. So that, for example, in the example that was listed, I illustrated it with respect to adherence to the COVID protective behaviors. If you were talking about nutrition, you might be talking about what people buy in shops, what people put on their plates, how much of it they consume. You'd have to be precise about the behavior and thinking about the technique is that you apply to that. And if you go back to thinking about the kind of links you're making, when we did the COVID one, it was very clear that if self-efficacy was the issue, there was no point in telling people why it was useful, because people had probably already decided they wanted to do it. And what was stopping them doing it was their capability, not their motivation. And so a technique that's to do with raising motivation is irrelevant when you've got people who are motivated and what they're lacking is capability. The kind of behaviors, so I'm guessing that the person who's asking this question works in the food area, but just to, Martha can probably illustrate a bit in the kind of areas she's worked on. We've been doing it on work to do with how people respond to a myocardial infarction and whether they contact, whether they ring the services quickly when they're having a heart attack to reduce cardiac delay. And next week, we're going to be working on a project where we're trying to improve the messaging that people give when someone calls the emergency services. What's the message that the call handler gives to enable people to move quickly to dealing well with a medical emergency? So those are the kind of things I've been working on most recently. Martha, I'm guessing you're in the physical activity domain, probably many other things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think about the specific aspect on how this applies to the different behaviors. And I think we can, I mean, we have different examples within physical activity, but I think it is important to also clarify, just because I don't want to forget that point, that if you go to the studies that were done within the development of the TAT tool, and I mentioned this before, you will see that for the literature review, there were, I think, 10 health behaviors that were part of the studies that were the basis for study 1. And then in the expert consensus study, the questions were made without thinking of specific health behaviors. So the questions weren't made just for physical activity or dietary behaviors, but the links between MOAs and BCTs and interventions in general, so that I don't forget that point, Mary, which I think is important. And I forgot what was your specific question, Mary.
What were the behaviours you've been working on? So you've done lots of physical activity ones. We've done physical activity ones too, particularly with people with disabling conditions, but you've been working on other kinds of physical activity interventions.
Yeah, but the specific question was, sorry, in terms of the physical.
Which behaviours? So someone was asking about the range of behaviours.
Yeah, sorry. So when we talk about physical activity, we can talk. We've done studies in looking, like in promoting walking, but also in increasing, muscle strength exercises. In behaviors related with also reducing sedentary time behavior. And usually when we start to break what are all the behaviors that we are looking at, and then which mechanisms of action link with all of that, we end up in certain cases actually targeting 10, 15, or 20 different behaviors within physical activity. And just also because I think this can be relevant for people watching, you might be aware that as part of the behavior change intervention ontology, we're also developing the human behavior ontology, where we try to classify different behaviors. And once that is also released, you will look in certain aspects related with physical activity and diet and other things, the amount of different behaviors that you can have associated with them and where they fit. And I think there is a lot of complexity there, and we can't, as Mary was saying, we can't just say MOA, BCT, diet, MOA, BCT, physical activity, because there's more complexity to that.
One of the things that you might want to watch in particular is that sometimes in a study, the BCTs may be directed at engaging people in the program rather than with behavior change. So you see this certainly in the smoking literature, where there are BCTs directed at and encouraging people to attend classes, and other BCTs are directed at smoking cessation, and other BCTs are directed at maintenance of cessation once people have managed to quit. So it's very important to specify the behavior. So within your nutrition school feeding programs, you'll have lots and lots of behaviors, and it helps to specify them. Mm. The next question comes from Rachel Skews, and it's about what are the processes being referred to as mechanisms of action as opposed to mechanisms of change, which is the main nomenclature I've seen in the literature. I just want to check they're synonymous. I'm not sure they are exactly synonymous, because the mechanisms of change are what intervenes between a behavior change technique and a behavior change. I think that the mechanisms of change have more elements to them than just the action of the BCT. This is about the mechanism of the action of the BCT on the behavior. Yeah. Do you want to add, Martha? Sorry.
I think from the literature I know where mechanisms of change is also quite used is more on psychotherapy and mental health interventions, where I think that other things related with the processes of the relationship with the therapist and other things are also included as potential mechanisms of change, which is different from what we are talking about here, as Mary was saying.
One of the things that happens when we develop the ontology is we make fairly precise definitions of the entities in the ontology. So mechanisms of action will have a precise definition, which I can't provide now because I'm not good at remembering the definitions.
I can say what it is. I have it here in front of me.
I'm going to come to you in a moment. The important thing is that if your definition of mechanism of change is the same, you should be able to see that it's the same. And then it allows you to identify it as the same computer readable entity, because the label doesn't define it. It is the definition that defines it. And that is really important, because it means that you can use whatever label you particularly want without messing up the actually defining characteristics. Just in the same way as you have a name that is your legal name, but people may call you all sorts of things, but you're still the same person.
And
The definition.
Can I also, the definition is the process causally active in the relationship between behavior change intervention scenario and its outcome behavior. That's the definition we have, which they are available in some of the papers on Welcome Open Research, and will be on the Mechanisms of Action ontology paper. Can I just add another thing to that, Mary, is that one good feature that we also have in the ontologies is that we have the synonyms for the different things that we are providing. So when there are entities, as Mary was saying, that they are actually meaning the same thing, but they have different names, they can be added as synonyms to the ontology, as long as we identify, we or whoever is doing that, identifies that is actually exactly the same thing, but with a different label.
The next question I think we've kind of dealt with, will the TAT be updated in accordance with the BCT ontology and the MOA ontology? That would be very nice, but remember we're talking about 200 multiplied by 200 and it gets even more complicated. So we don't have plans to do that at the moment, but I imagine somebody's thinking about it, because there's always more to do, isn't there?
Yeah, and it's a collaborative process. So we keep on saying this. We're welcoming anyone to help and join in developing these tools further and bringing also ideas for that.
And someone asks, is pointing out that they're interested in risks near water, and they're thinking of having a play with the tool. I was certainly contacted by people from the life-saving organisation in the UK, the Royal National Lifeboat Institute. I think that's correct, because they've identified that there are behaviours that are risky and that behaviour change techniques may be relevant there. I also think that this idea of having a play with the tool is a really good idea, because then you begin to get a sense of how it's working and what it's doing. So I strongly recommend to anyone have a play with it and think about it with respect to your own particular context.
And one thing that you can also do, talking about intervention development, and when it is in areas where you might have less information, you can use the tool as a first step or as a basis to look at the potential links. And then you can also do your stakeholder consultation or look at other literature to identify what shows up there and use this as two bases to start developing your intervention. And then, of course, when you assess things, you will identify what is actually a mechanism of action and what is not a mechanism of action in your own context.
The next question is about, can TAT help to develop interventions to move people on in their willingness to engage with change? It can only help you if you can identify this mechanism of action, willingness to change. And I'm guessing the nearest thing to willingness to change in our ontology, in the TAT tool would be motivation. Any more thoughts on that? Do you think there's anything better in willingness to change, Marta?
No, I think it's mainly motivation, but this reminds me of the importance to clearly identify what we mean when we say willingness to engage with change. It can be different things, right? So we can be talking about motivation, but there can also be aspects related with, what are the levels of self-efficacy or other aspects related with that might be interfering. And it's that correct separation of the different potential mechanisms of action that can help with the BCTs. But as Mary was saying, you need to identify that correctly. And if you say it's motivation, then you have a basis to see which BCTs might be useful to increase motivation, and then look at the literature available also for that.
Okay, I think we're nearing the end of our time. There are still some questions, and just to reassure people, the questions we will collect all the questions and try to answer them. That's one of the tasks we have planned for our future. There are also questions about signposting, and I think there are some answers in the chat about the publications that are coming out. So I think the links are there. Any further questions or comments, if you scan this QR code or click on the link that was posted in the chat box, it can allow you to provide more comments, more reflections, because I think lots of things you said today are really useful and interesting to us. So thank you very much for the things you provided. The next webinar in the series is on the 31st of May at 4 p.m. And this is the last one in this series, and it's about optimizing human artificial intelligence for knowledge use. And I think that will be Susan Michie, and I apologize again for her not being here today, Professor Jana Hastings and Professor James Thomas. Beyond that, on the 6th of June from 2 to 5 p.m. UK time, we're going to launch the Human Behaviour Change Project Knowledge System, so that it will actually enable people to see the tools that have been developed during the project and how they can be used. Going beyond that, in October, there will be an online part of the international training program at the UCL Centre for Behaviour Change. Will be a module on the BCT taxonomy, from the BCT taxonomy to BCT ontology, what's new in the ontology and how do you use it. So that's a more extensive one-day period of teaching. Can I just thank everyone for coming on the call today. It's been a pleasure to see the kind of questions you raise and all the nice work that you think we should be doing, and we look forward to collaborating with you on some of that work in the future. On this last slide are lots of connections that may be useful to you, the usual kind of connections, including the website for the Human Behaviour Change Project. It also gives you the link for the Open Science Framework, where all of our stuff and our slides and everything is cited there. You should be able to get anything about this project there. The YouTube recordings of this webinar and the previous webinars. I think that's all we want to say today. Anything you want to add, Marta? Have I missed anything?
No, just reinforce that if you can come to the session on the 6th of June, where you will see all the tools that were developed and how now we can use them. I think it's going to be a really useful session.
Thank you very much for being with us today. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye.